In this video, we are going to discuss classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning. This is a foundational concept, a building block in the field of psychology. Now, whatever field, the subfield that you mention, whether it's clinical, counseling, cognitive, developmental, organizational, neuropsychological, etc., how we learn, how we unlearn, how we learn what we have unlearned, how we acquire fears, how we overcome fears, how we acquire aversions, how we overcome aversions, likes and dislikes. Classical conditioning is a foundational concept in all of psychology. So, in this video, we are going to learn the basic terms that we need to know, specifically 4 basic terms, which are the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response. And we're going to learn about these terms and what pairing is and how an individual or organism, as we can say, learns and unlearns, also called extinction. We're going to build upon psychological concepts in classical conditioning and eventually move on to operant conditioning. Towards the end of the video, I will explain how this is related to Indian philosophy through meditation, psychological studies concerning meditation. Now, if you haven't already subscribed, please do so by hitting the lotus icon on the bottom right of the screen for more videos on Indian philosophy, psychology, Sanskrit, and many more interesting topics. So let us begin. Ivan Pavlov, born 1849 and died 1936, was a Russian physiologist. As a physiologist, he was interested in the function of the body. Along with the structure, he was interested in answering the question, how does the body work? How does it function? Now, he was particularly interested in the digestive system of dogs. He was interested in from the initiation of salivation and all the way including the other processes of digestion. Now, he started to become interested in these particular biological, physiological topics by coming across neural reflexes, right? The reflexes of the brain. Prior to that, he studied theology. His family wanted him to study theology, right? But he came across these biological, physiological concepts and he got really fascinated with it and slowly moved towards experimentation in these fields. And so we come to a point where he started to do repeated experiments on dogs. He wanted to study the digestive tracts, right? The digestive functions of dogs, including the neural functions, right, of particular animals as well. And so he conducted a lot of experiments where he happened to stumble upon classical conditioning, the foundational concepts of classical conditioning. Now, it's important to remember this, that about 100 to 150 years ago, there was no established field of psychology like we have today, right? Many of the findings in psychology, right, were discovered by people in different fields, like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung. They were doctors, right? They were physicians or neurologists, right? Even Pavlov was a physiologist, right? So they were in completely different fields. And so they contributed to finding and pretty much establishing the field of psychology, putting together people's different work, you know? So it wasn't like there was a field of psychology to begin with. It started to develop from the findings in medicine and, you know, biology and other scientific fields. So Ivan Pavlov, when performing his experiments involving gastric juices, started to notice something about dog behavior. So when he presented meat powder or some sort of food to a dog, when the dog's senses contacted the sense object, right, which was the meat powder, the dog began to salivate. If it was already salivating, it started to salivate more. So upon noticing the meat powder, the dog would begin to salivate. The process of digestion began. So Ivan Pavlov noticed this, right? This was obvious, you know. We salivate, you know, dogs, humans, etc. We salivate when we see food. Digestion, the process of digestion begins with salivation. Now, he noticed that even before the dog sees the food, when the dog hears the footsteps of him coming, the dog begins to salivate. So the dog hears the footsteps and the dog starts to salivate before the food is even seen. So in a way, the footsteps represent a predictive tendency, right? A predictive, something's going to happen, right? Something's going to happen, food is going to be given, and I need to salivate now. And it's not conscious, it's a natural process, right? So Pavlov noticed this. So he decided to run experiments. Now this is where the foundational experiment begins with classical conditioning. Now, Ivan Pavlov brought a metronome. Metronome is one of those devices that, it just moves like this and it goes tick, 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 right? It makes a certain noise. So in psychology textbooks and lectures, people will tell you he used a bell. It wasn't a bell, it's a mistranslation. It was a metronome or a buzzing sort of device that went tick, 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 right? So he had a metronome. And what he did was he made the dog listen to the sound of the metronome. So tick, tick, tick. And then he presented food to the dog. So what happens when you hear a metronome? No reaction whatsoever, right? You hear a metronome, it goes tick, 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 and you go, okay, well, there's a metronome. But what happened was, after he presented the metronome and it went tick, 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 he presented beet powder. And so the dog salivated like it normally did. So then he presented the metronome noise again, tick, 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 and then meat powder. And then the dog salivated. Tick, 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 meat powder. The dog salivated. He repeated the pairing over and over and over again until finally, when he presented the metronome and it went tick, 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 the dog started salivating even before the food was presented. Now, if you remember, the food is the primary reason why the dog is salivating, when the dog sees the food. But the metronome started to act as a predictor or an indicator that the food is coming. So something that was once neutral now has some charge to it and suddenly has the same potential to produce a physiological reaction of salivation as the food itself did. So something that's neutral now is able to produce a biological reaction in something. So this is the fundamental concept of classical conditioning. So let's go through the terms to better understand what this is. And I want us to understand that these 4 terms are going to really make us grasp the concept really well. If you can understand these 4 terms, you could understand a lot of classical conditioning. It's going to build upon it, okay? So first and foremost, the first term is unconditioned stimulus. Now, a stimulus is just a general term, right? It's an event or a thing that produces a reaction in the environment or produces a reaction in you, right? Stimulus is just a thing that does something, right? It stimulates, right? So an unconditioned stimulus, right, quite literally just means that something that is not conditioned, something that is natural, something that naturally produces a biological response in someone or something else, okay? It's not conditioned. That means it was always there. So when you hear the term unconditioned stimulus, think a biological stimulus that produces a biological reaction in someone or something else, right? So an unconditioned stimulus, in this case, is food. Food is an unconditional stimulus. Why? Because it creates a biological reaction in something else. In this case, the food caused the dog to salivate. Another example is a puff of air that goes into your eye, which is another conditioning procedure called eye blink conditioning. If someone administers a puff of air in your eye, you're going to blink. And so the puff of air is the unconditioned stimulus that causes you to blink. Blinking is a natural response. Salivating is a natural response, right? If someone shocks you, you're going to shake or freeze. Shaking or freezing is a natural response, and the shock is the unconditioned stimulus. So once again, the unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that causes a biological reaction in someone or something else. Okay? And in this case, food. The conditioned stimulus is something that is initially neutral, right? So in this case, the metronome, it's neutral. It doesn't produce any reaction, right? But eventually, it produces the reaction that is similar to the unconditioned stimulus. So in this case, the food. So the metronome initially is neutral. It doesn't produce any reactions. It's the conditioned stimulus, right? So it's the conditioned stimulus without any value. Then when you put the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus together, like this, so the metronome and the food, and you repeatedly pair it, then the conditioned stimulus suddenly starts to have value, and it has the same value as the unconditioned stimulus. So initially, it didn't do anything. Tick, 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 okay? But then eventually, tick, 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 salivation. It starts to have the same value or potency as the unconditioned stimulus. So it's called a conditioned stimulus because it's learned. It's not something you naturally develop, right? A lot of our fears are conditioned. A lot of our likes and dislikes are conditioned. Things that are just neutral at first, right? People, places, things, etc. start to become conditioned. Let's say you're in a relationship and you're with someone and you meet someone. You're pretty neutral to that person, right, initially. And so let's say you begin to like them. Then suddenly they start to have some sort of value, right? They become less neutral and more valuable in some way. Let's say you go to Six Flags or Disney World with them. You associate that place with that person, right? So let's say if the relationship doesn't work anymore, right? And you feel sour about that relationship, then you're going to associate that place with that person because of the charge, the particular conditioning that's established, the conditioned stimulus. This is called higher order conditioning, and we'll go through it, where the energy of the sort of the valence, right? The energy starts to transfer to other neutral stimuli. So suddenly, parks and popcorn and, movies and stuff, they all get associated with that bad, sour taste that you have in that particular relationship you had. So the goal is to break and separate them, which we will go over. So again, unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that produces a biological response. It's natural, it's always been there. A conditioned stimulus is something that is not natural, something you have to learn through repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus, okay? The unconditioned response goes with the unconditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus is the food, the unconditioned response is the salivation. Simple. The unconditioned response is blinking, right? If the unconditioned stimulus is a puff of air, the unconditioned response is blinking. If the unconditioned stimulus is shock, then the unconditioned stimulus is freezing, right? So if the unconditioned stimulus is food, then the unconditioned response is salivation, right? So the unconditioned response is just that natural biological response that occurs as a result of the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. That's all that is. And finally, the conditioned response is associated with the conditioned stimulus. Right? The conditioned stimulus is something that once has no value and is neutral, then starts to have value and neutral and becomes less neutral, right? So initially neutral and becomes something with value or conditioned. So the response that comes after it's conditioned is called the conditioned response. Okay, so this is the conditioned stimulus, the metronome, and the food is the unconditioned stimulus. This has no value, right? It gets paired, boom, then it starts to have value because it starts to produce the same response of salivation as the food. And this response of salivation, right, is initially the unconditioned response, right? But through repeated pairing, it also is known as the conditioned response. Okay? So if this is the unconditioned stimulus, this is a conditioned stimulus, and this is the conditioned response here. Remember, the conditioned stimulus has two phases. Phase one is no value, right? Phase two is value. Let's look at it like that. So in its no value state, the conditioned stimulus has no conditioned response. It doesn't do anything. When it starts to be paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, it starts to adapt the same response as the food naturally did. And so that conditioned response starts to have value. Okay? So just keep repeating this concept over and over again. And if you have any questions, we'll definitely go over it. Let's go over some of these concepts here. Now, I mentioned learning. This is the process of learning. Learning is one component of classical conditioning, right? The dog learns that the metronome is going to predict the unconditioned stimulus, and so it starts to salivate. It learns that this metronome has some sort of value, a predictive value, right? So if I say, here's a ruler, right? And you're like, okay, cool. But then after I say, here's a ruler, and then I make a huge loud sound that scares you, you're going to be like, okay, you're going to get shocked, you're going to get scared, because, right, the sound is scary. If I say ruler again, and then make a huge loud sound again, and then a ruler again, huge loud sound again, the second you see the ruler, you're going to know, oh, a loud sound is about to come, right? So that is a sort of learning that occurs in that particular situation. So what happens when all of a sudden the dog hears the metronome but no longer sees the food, right? So it goes tick, 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 the dog salivates, looks for the food, but it's not there. Okay, maybe an hour later, tick, 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 the dog salivates, looks for the food, but it's not there. And you do it again and again. What happens then? What happens is the process of extinction. What the dog once learned, that this metronome indicates that the certain, food is going to come, right? So it salivates. The food no longer comes anymore, right? So then the dog stops salivating gradually. What was once learned starts to become extinct, right? So even if the dog salivates, but then starts to realize that there's no food 5, 10, 15, 20 times afterwards, 25, 30 times afterwards, the dog's salivation is going to decrease because it's no longer associated. The conditioned stimulus, the metronome, is no longer associated with the unconditioned stimulus. The metronome is no longer associated with the food. It's just metronome, metronome, metronome. And then so salivation, salivation, no more salivation, right? That's called extinction. But then what is reacquisition, right? Have you ever learned a skill and it took you so long to learn it? Then after you learned it, you took a break, pretty much like a year break, and you kind of forgot about it. But after a year, you practiced it for a week or two, and then you just acquired it really fast. In fact, faster than when you originally started to learn it. For example, an instrument or driving or whatever it is, right? This is called reacquisition, right? So reacquisition indicates that something that you've learned, that you forget about it, you abandon it, and you come back, it comes back off, fairly quickly compared to when you learned it. This is another concept in classical conditioning. And we're going to go into these more specifically, but I'm just presenting some ideas here. In higher order conditioning, this is so fascinating. This is what I was talking about when, if you're in a relationship and let's say the relationship doesn't go well, but you went to all these places with that partner, then you start to associate the relationship content with those places, right? So all of a sudden you see a heart, you listen to certain music, you listen to, you listen to some sort of a band or a musician, right? You go to, let's say, a restaurant that you guys went to. All of these places start to have this negative, sour, feeling or valence. It's because of higher order conditioning, where initially there's so many neutral stimuli, neutral, 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 and then there's this one unconditioned stimuli that's really negative, right? And all of a sudden, it starts to be associated with all of them and spread and spread and spread. So this is how one can develop phobias and fears and anxieties, right? So in clinical psychology, it's very, very important, certain systematic desensitization, right? Or flooding, right? So these are certain types of techniques that are used. Exposure and response prevention. People with anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. These are all, these all have the premise of classical conditioning, how people learn and develop fears, right? So a person gets chased by a dog, then the person starts to think all dogs are bad, right? If they get bitten by a dog and, they start to think all dogs are bad and they generalize the fear. And so you have to teach them that not all dogs are bad or, are going to bite you, etc. So a lot of fears and anxieties are created from classical conditioning, right? That, let's say, for example, you walk into a room and, you just take a brief look and then suddenly you're anxious. You don't know why, right? Look back at the room and you saw a podium. What does a podium remind you of? Public speaking, right? So you see a podium and suddenly you feel anxious. You don't know. Podium is neutral. It's a conditioned stimulus. It's neutral, but it's associated with the unconditioned stimulus of public speaking. So podium and unconditioned stimulus of public speaking put together, then the podium has a certain content to it. So you walk into a classroom, you might think, ooh, like, I remember the days that I was public speaking, etc. Whatever it is, you associate these things. If someone is a cigarette smoker, right, you look at your friend and you think a friend who's also a smoker, and you look at that friend and that person also reminds you of smoking, right? That's why friend group is really important with like drinking and smoking, etc. Whatever addictions that you have, the environment that you surround yourself with, right? It can act as triggers. These are all conditioned or unconditioned stimuli. So these are very important concepts right here. In a 2019 psychological study by researchers Hanley and Garland called Mindfulness Training Disrupts Classical Conditioning, these researchers explored how mindfulness experimental conditions can actually delay conditioned response acquisition, okay, and the frequency of conditioned responding. So let me break this down. So in two situations, right, you have an experimental group, so a group of people who follow these experimental conditions, you're doing experiment on them, and a control group. You're not really putting them towards any conditions, right? So we'll go over these, this terminology at some point. Experimental group and a control group, okay? So the experimental group goes through mindfulness training. Now what's mindfulness? Briefly, mindfulness, also called sati, from the Satipatthana Sutta in Buddhism, right? Indian philosophical school, Buddhist, right? Or Bauddha, right? Mindfulness is a meditative technique where the individual has to sit down, back straight, close their eyes, and focus entirely on the breath, the inhalation and the exhalation of the breath. The text will say, a mindful person will know when he inhales, will know when he exhales, will know when he does this and know when he does that. It's very, very, it's all about attention. The attention is drawn towards the breath. So as you're sitting down, no matter where your mind goes, your thoughts can go in any direction, you acknowledge it and just say, back to the breath. Acknowledge it, back to the breath. School, marriage, children, finances, etc. Wherever it goes, worries, goes back to the breath. You have to keep pulling it back. And every time you pull it back, right, you train your brain or you train your mind in such a way that you keep bringing everything back to the present moment and you keep living in the present moment. Now, there is an abundance of psychological literature showing that this actually works, that mindfulness changes brain morphology, right? Changes the structure and functioning of your brain and decreases fear responses. So in this particular study, right, mindfulness, the experimental group is exposed to mindfulness. So there's a group of people and they're practicing mindfulness and the control group isn't doing it. Then both of them are given a classical conditioning task called eye blink conditioning, right? Where they're presented with the tone beep and then a puff of air in their eye and then they blink. So the tone beep is the conditioned stimulus because it's neutral, right? The puff of air is the unconditioned stimulus because it produces a biological response, and the biological response is blinking, right? The unconditioned response, right? So what they found was the group that did mindfulness had a delayed conditioned response acquisition. What does this mean? What is the conditioned response acquisition? The conditioned response, right, is the same thing as the unconditioned response, which is the eye blink, right? So when you put the unconditioned stimulus, which is the puff of air, with the conditioned stimulus, the beep, right? You put them together, eventually the beep is gonna make you blink, right? So beep, puff, blink, beep, puff, blink, beep, puff, blink, beep, blink, right? That's what's going to happen at some point. So let's say, typically, right, so I don't have the specific number of the trial, etc., but let's say the 6th trial, right? So it goes beep, puff, blink, right? So beep, puff, blink. Let's say in the 6th trial, they acquired the conditioned response, right? So on the 6th trial, as soon as they heard the beep, then they blinked. They didn't need the puff, right? They blinked when they heard the beep. Let's say it took them to the 6th trial, right? So they acquired an unconditioned response. They acquired a conditioned response through the unconditioned, through the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus, right? In the mindfulness condition, in the experimental condition, that was delayed to maybe the 9th or the 10th or maybe even the 12th trial, much later on. So this is really important. It indicates that when a person practices mindfulness, the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that, let's say, is fearful or causes a biological reaction, is not easily associated with something that's neutral, right? What's neutral is a tone. If you do mindfulness, it's not easily associated. When you're sitting in meditative awareness and you're not reacting, or you're seeing your reactions and you're pulling away and bringing it back to the breath, for some reason, it does something, right? Where it doesn't associate neutral stimuli to the fearful thing. It just leaves the fearful thing as it is and separates it, which is fantastic, because then you're not going to really deal with the core of mental illness to a certain extent. Much of mental illness is caused by these associations, right, between the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, and then it's just spreading and spreading to all these neutral things. So they found that if you do mindfulness, you don't acquire these things and they don't spread that easily. And in fact, your conditioned responding decreases too. So not only does it take long to acquire or spread, also, you don't respond as much as if you didn't do mindfulness. If you don't do mindfulness, you respond more frequently, so more blinks, right? And also, you respond more early. Like you acquire it quickly, and you respond more frequently. In the mindfulness condition, you acquire it much later, and you respond less frequently. This is fascinating. This indicates that mindfulness has some disrupting quality on classical conditioning. It's one of the first studies that have come out that talk about mindfulness in the relationship with classical conditioning. I'll make another video on this and go deeper into this, but I wanted to talk about this to draw the similarities between, or the parallel between Indian philosophy, mindfulness, calming the mind, doing yoga, physical postures, pranayama, etc., and also these psychological studies that are showing proof and evidence slowly by slowly about these practices that were there. Now, you have to do them in a rigorous experimental setting and with a lot of statistics and properly done, right? But if you can fuse these two worlds, then you can understand your own spiritual path or your own religious inclinations, and you can also understand psychology more efficiently, right? So I feel that psychology can provide the data in these religious texts, can allow the conceptual mind to increase, right, with these psychologically scientific driven fields and combine them together. So I wanted to talk about this. We're going to talk about a lot of psychological concepts. We're going to talk about a lot of philosophical concepts, more psychological studies as well. So for now, we'll leave it at that, and we'll go deeply into classical conditioning in further videos, and then eventually operant conditioning. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so by hitting the lotus icon in the bottom right of the screen, and we will have more videos on Indian philosophy, psychology, and Sanskrit. So thank you.